The well was supposed to be for him alone, a grave dug into the earth, offering up life only to take it back in dust and sweat. But today, it had offered up a man. Sprawled beside the stone lip, a stain of dark red spreading from his side, was an Apache warrior, his breath a ragged whisper against the baked ground. Every voice from Silas's past screamed at him, "Leave him! It's not your fight!" They were the voices of fear, the voices of the town, the ghosts of burned-out homesteads and stories told in hushed, hateful tones. But the man's eyes, cracked open just a slit, held not a threat, but a plea. Silas saw not a warrior, but a son, a brother. He saw the last breath of a man far from home. And in that moment, seeing the tremor in the man's hand, a mirror of the tremor in his own soul, he made a choice that would burn his quiet world to the ground. He knelt, the worn leather of his knees cracking, and reached not for his rifle, but for his canteen. The silence of the plains was broken by the sound of a man choosing mercy over wisdom. A sound like a lock turning on a door he could never again open. He hoisted the dead weight of the stranger over his shoulders, the blood warm and sticky against his shirt, and carried him away from the well, away from the unforgiving sun, and into the cool, dark confessional of his home. Inside the cabin, the world shrank to the scent of pine, dust, and blood. Silas laid the man on his own narrow cot, the one piece of comfort he allowed himself. The stranger was younger than he'd first thought, his face carved with a pain that went deeper than the festering wound in his side. Silas worked with a grim purpose he hadn't felt in years, his hands steady as he sliced away the blood-stiffened buckskin. He had stitched up livestock, set his own bones, but this felt different. This felt like a prayer. He cleaned the wound with whiskey, earning a pained grunt from the unconscious man. As he worked, binding the gash with clean strips of linen torn from his late wife's last good dress, his mind drifted. He saw a smaller body, pale and feverish in this very same bed. His son, Thomas, his breath growing shallower with each passing hour, while Silas, helpless, could only hold his hand and watch the light fade from his eyes. He had failed to save his own blood. The thought was a familiar phantom, a cold spot in the heart of the cabin that no fire could warm. He looked down at the Apache, a stranger whose life now rested in the same hands that had let his own son slip away. This wasn't redemption. It was just something to do, a rock to push against the tide of his own grief. He finished the binding, his knuckles white. The stranger's breathing was still shallow, but even, for now. Silas's gaze fell upon a small, beaded leather pouch tied to the man's belt. It seemed too important to be a simple accessory. He hesitated, his fingers hovering over the intricate knot. It felt like a violation, another line to cross. But the men who had put that bullet in him were still out there. Knowing why might be the only thing that kept them both alive. He gently untied the pouch. Inside, nestled in soft deer hide, was not a weapon or a trinket, but a tightly rolled piece of parchment, sealed with a crest he didn't recognize. It was a document, official, and heavy with a purpose he could already feel settling over his home like a shroud. The next day, the silence was broken by hoofbeats, not the frantic gallop of a posse, but the tired, plodding rhythm of a neighbor. Silas watched through the grimy window as old Jedediah Finch reined in his horse, his face a roadmap of sun-baked worry. Jedediah was a creature of routine and communal fear, his opinions shaped by the whispers that blew like tumbleweeds through the nearest town. Silas stepped onto the porch, wiping his hands on his trousers, schooling his face into a mask of weary indifference. "Jedediah," he grunted, a nod serving as a greeting. Jedediah stayed on his horse, looking down with an air of nervous authority. "Silas, heard some commotion up this way. Talk in town as a band of Chiricahua jumped the reservation line. Caused some trouble down at the surveyor's camp. He squinted, his eyes scanning the ranch, lingering on the cabin door. You seen anything? Silas could feel the stranger's presence behind him, a silent weight in the small cabin. A single word could end this. A single lie could begin something far worse. Just the usual, Silas said, his voice flat. Coyotes and heat. Jedediah chewed on his lip, not entirely convinced. Barrow's putting a posse together, headed by that foreman of his, Fletcher. They ain't the type to ask questions twice. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. If you see anything at all, you best just point them in the right direction. No sense getting your own fences burned for a fight that ain't yours. The threat was veiled in friendly advice. A communal warning. Stay in line. Don't stick your neck out. Silas just nodded again, his jaw tight. I'll keep that in mind. As Jedediah turned his horse and trotted away, the dust settling in his wake, Silas felt the walls of his isolation crumble. He had lied. He had chosen a side. He was no longer just a grieving man in a lonely cabin. He was an accomplice. He went back inside, the air thick with unspoken truths. The man on the cot was watching him, his dark eyes lucid and sharp. The silence that followed was heavier than any words. Water! The voice was a dry rasp, the first word the stranger had spoken. Silas brought a cup, holding it to his lips. The man drank deeply, his eyes never leaving Silas's face. He finished, leaning back with a sigh that was half pain, half relief. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, two men from different worlds, trapped in the same four walls. The question hung between them, unspoken but deafening. Finally, the stranger asked it. Why? Silas had no grand answer. He shrugged, gesturing vaguely around the cabin, at the empty chair where his wife used to sit, at the cold hearth. Felt right, he said, the words inadequate. You needed water. A flicker of understanding, or maybe just acceptance, crossed the man's face. He pushed himself up, wincing. My name is Kale. He spoke slowly, his English measured and deliberate. He pointed to the pouch Silas had placed on the small table. You looked. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact. Silas nodded. The men who did this, he said, gesturing to Kale's bandaged side. They'll be back. Kale's expression hardened. He reached for the pouch, his movements careful. He unrolled the parchment. It was a treaty, old and brittle at the creases, signed by a U.S. Army general and marked with the thumbprints of Apache elders. Beside it, he unrolled a newer, cruder map. This land, Kale said, his finger tracing the lines of a river valley on the map, is ours by this treaty. He then pointed to a section marked with an X. Barrow, the Baron. He says it is his. He brings papers from the government, but they are lies. He paused, his breath catching. The men who shot me, they work for him. They were not hunting me. They were hunting this. He tapped the treaty. This is the truth. They want to bury it, like they buried my family to get the land. The pieces clicked into place for Silas. This wasn't just a wounded man. This was a messenger, a witness. And the paper in his hands wasn't just a claim to land. It was a testament to a crime. He was no longer sheltering a man. He was protecting the last shred of a people's honor. The posse arrived at dusk, not as a trickle, but as a flood. A dozen riders, their forms dark silhouettes against a blood-orange sky, fanning out to surround the small homestead. They moved with the cold efficiency of predators. At their head was a man Silas recognized by reputation alone. Fletcher. His face was granite, his eyes chips of ice. He rode a big black horse that seemed as cruel as its master. They stopped just beyond rifle range, a silent, menacing wall of men and steel. "Silas!" Fletcher's voice cut through the evening air, devoid of warmth or courtesy. "We know he's in there. We tracked him right to your well. Send out the Apache killer, and we'll forget we ever saw you." It wasn't a negotiation. It was a command. Inside, Cale had pulled himself to the window, his hand resting on the hilt of a knife Silas hadn't noticed before. His face was a mask of calm, lethal resolve. He was ready to die, but not alone. Silas looked from Cale's determined face to the circle of riders outside. This was the moment Jedediah had warned him about. The precipice. They offered him a way out. A simple lie, a simple betrayal, and he could go back to his quiet life of grief, to the ghosts he knew. He could shut the door and let the world handle its own ugly business. But as he looked at Cale, he didn't see an Apache killer. He saw a man trying to keep a promise to his dead family. He saw the same hopeless fight he had waged against his son's fever. This time, however, the enemy had a face. What would you do when the cost of doing the right thing is your own life, and the cost of doing nothing is your soul? Silas picked up his old Winchester rifle from its pegs by the door. He didn't shout or make a grand speech. He simply stepped onto the porch, the rifle held loosely in his hands, and stood there, a solitary figure against the encroaching darkness. He said nothing. His silence was the only answer Fletcher needed. Night fell like a blanket, thick and starless. The posse settled in for a siege, their campfires flickering like malevolent eyes in the darkness. Inside the cabin, the tension was a living thing. Silas lit a single lamp, keeping the windows dark. He found some dried jerky and a stale biscuit, splitting the meager meal in two. He handed a portion to Cale. They ate in silence for a while, the only sounds the crackle of the lamp's wick and the distant, low murmur of the men outside. "This is a bad death," Cale said, his voice quiet. "Trapped in a box," Silas grunted in agreement. "Better than some." Cale managed a faint wry smile. "You are not a good cook." Silas almost smiled back. "Heard that before." The brief moment of humor passed, leaving the grim reality in its wake. "They killed them in the winter," Cale said, his gaze distant, looking at a memory playing out on the cabin wall. "My wife, my daughter. Barrow's men said it was raiders, but it was them. They wanted the valley, where the river runs even when the plains are dry." He looked at Silas. "I carry this paper not for the land. The land is already lost. I carry it for her name, for my little girl's name, so the world knows they were not nothing." Silas felt a familiar ache in his chest. He saw Thomas's small, still face. "I had a son," he heard himself say, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "Thomas. The sickness took him, stared right at me, and he just stopped." The confession hung in the air, a ghost shared between them. Two fathers, hollowed out by loss. The fight outside was no longer about a piece of paper or a plot of land. It was about two empty spaces at two different tables. It was for the names of the dead. Silas picked up his rifle, the wood smooth and cool beneath his hand. "Well," he said, his voice rough, "let's make sure they remember ours." The first assault came just before dawn, in the gray, uncertain light where shadows played tricks on the eyes. A volley of shots shattered the morning calm, splintering the wood around the windows. Silas and Cale hit the floor, the air suddenly thick with the smell of gunpowder and hot lead. "The barn!" Cale hissed, pointing towards the back. Two of Fletcher's men were using it for cover, trying to get a clear line of fire to the cabin's less fortified rear. Silas didn't need to think. He scrambled to the back window, his old Winchester feeling like an extension of his arm. He wasn't a gunslinger, but he was a rancher. He knew how to shoot a coyote stealing a chicken from 100 yards in bad light. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. One of the men cried out and fell back. The other returned fire, the shot thudding into the wall just inches from Silas's head. KL was already moving. With a grace that defied his injury, he slipped out the back door, using the stone well as cover. He moved like a phantom, a knife in one hand, a rock in the other. He threw the rock far to the left. The remaining gunman flinched, turning toward the sound. It was all the opening Cale needed. He closed the distance in 3 silent strides. Silas saw a brief, brutal struggle, a flash of steel, and then silence. Cale reappeared at the door, his breath coming in ragged bursts, a fresh gash on his arm. He held up 2 fingers. 2 down. But their victory was short-lived. A new threat bloomed in the darkness, a flickering orange light. Fire, Silas breathed. They were trying to burn him out. He saw a man running toward the porch with a lit torch. There was no time to aim. He fired from the hip, a desperate, angry shot. The running figure stumbled and fell, the torch sputtering out in the damp dirt. The quiet returned, heavier this time, laced with the metallic tang of blood. They had survived the first wave. But the cabin was scarred. Their ammunition was lower, and the sun was rising on a day that promised only more death. Hope arrived in the most unlikely form. Hours later, under the full heat of the midday sun, a single rider approached, waving a white cloth. It wasn't Fletcher. It was a young man, barely old enough to grow a proper beard, wearing the dusty badge of a deputy. Silas held his fire, watching him with deep suspicion. The deputy, Cale, dismounted with his hands held high and walked slowly toward the cabin. "I'm not with them," he called out, his voice cracking with nerves. "I was, but I'm not. Sheriff sent me out with the posse, but this ain't justice." Silas kept his rifle trained on him. "Get closer, and it won't be your concern." Cale stopped a safe distance away. "Fletcher's just the dog, Silas. The master Barrow is on his way. He's bringing more men. He's not looking to arrest anyone. He's looking to clean up a mess, erase it. You, the Apache, this whole ranch." He dropped a small sack on the ground. "Got some bandages, a little water. It's all I could sneak." Cale watched from the window, his expression unreadable. This was a trick. It had to be. But something in the boy's terrified eyes felt genuine. "Why?" Silas asked, the question sharp. Cale swallowed hard. "My father was a surveyor, honest man. He told me once that the original territorial maps, the ones the army drew up, showed that valley as Chiricahua land. He was told to correct them. He refused. Lost his job a week later. Died broke." The deputy looked past Silas toward the cabin. "What you're doing," he would have called it the right thing. Cale backed away slowly. "There's an old dry wash about a mile east of here. Cuts all the way to the mesas. If you run now, you might make it." He turned and fled before Silas could respond, kicking his horse into a gallop. Silas looked at the sack on the ground, then at Cale. The law was a lie. The posse was an execution squad, and their only chance of survival had just been handed to them by the ghost of an honest man. They didn't run. To run was to let Barrow win, to let the lie become the truth, to let their dead be forgotten. Instead, they prepared. The ranch was Silas's home. He knew every creak in the floorboards, every loose stone in the foundation. Cale knew the land, the way the light fell, the way sound traveled on the wind. Together, they turned the homestead into a trap. They used the last of Silas's lamp oil not for light, but for fire, soaking rags and placing them in the dry hay of the barn. They weakened the supports on the porch roof. They dug in, not in the cabin, but behind the stone walls of the well, the place where it had all begun. When Barrow and his reinforcements arrived, they found a silent, seemingly abandoned ranch. Fletcher, overconfident, led his men in. They stormed the empty cabin, finding nothing. Barrow sat on his horse, a portly man in a fine suit, a smug king surveying his domain. "Burn it!" Barrow commanded, his voice carrying across the yard. "Burn it all!" As Fletcher's men approached the barn with their torches, Silas gave a nod to Cale. Cale let out a piercing war cry from the far side of the property, a perfect mimicry that drew half the men's attention. In that moment of distraction, Silas fired. Not at a man, but at a lantern he'd hung precariously from a hook inside the barn door. It shattered, igniting the oil-soaked hay. The barn went up in a whoosh of flame and smoke. Men screamed, horses panicked. It was chaos! Under the cover of the fire, they made their move. They didn't fight to kill, they fought to survive. Fletcher, enraged, charged toward the well. Silas stood his ground. The fight was short and brutal. Not a duel of honor, but a desperate scramble in the dirt. But as they fought, Cale, using the fire as a distraction, had circled around. He came up behind Barrow, holding the treaty in one hand and a knife in the other. All the guns turned toward him. The standoff was no longer in the shadows, but in the open, illuminated by the flames of Silas's burning past. The fire from the barn cast long, dancing shadows, turning the scene into a tableau from hell. Every gun was on Cale, who stood unflinching before the land baron. "This paper," Cale said, his voice clear and strong, cutting through the crackle of the flames, "is the word of your own leaders. It speaks of honor." Barrow sneered, his face slick with sweat. "That paper is worthless. History is written by the men with the guns." Suddenly, another voice rang out. "Then let's make sure it's written right." From the edge of the chaos rode Deputy Cale, and behind him, not a posse, but a uniformed U.S. Marshal and 2 federal soldiers. Cale had not just brought a warning. He had brought the law. The real law. Barrow's face went from smug confidence to ashen panic. His hired guns looked at each other, their loyalty dissolving as quickly as the smoke. Fletcher, seeing the tide turn, made a last, desperate move, lunging for Silas. But Silas was ready. He didn't kill him. He brought the butt of his rifle down hard, and Fletcher collapsed in a heap. The fight was over. The aftermath was a field of quiet devastation. Barrow and his men were taken into custody, their lies undone by a piece of paper and the courage of 3 men. Silas's ranch, his home, everything he had owned, was a smoldering ruin. He stood by the well, the stone cool against his back, watching the dawn break over the ashes of his life. He had nothing left. Cale walked over to him, the treaty clutched in his hand. He looked at the wreckage, then at Silas. There were no grand speeches of thanks. None were needed. He simply placed a hand on Silas's shoulder. "The fire cleanses," he said softly. "It makes way for new growth." He looked out at the open plains, now bathed in the clean light of morning. "My people have a home. You have a home, if you will have it. You are not a stranger, Silas. You are a brother." Silas looked at the endless sky, a sky that once seemed to mock his loneliness. Now, it felt different. It felt like a promise. He had lost a home, but he had found a reason. Standing in the ruins, 2 men from 2 worlds, they were no longer defined by what they had lost, but by what they had saved.